Why, hello, fellow Patriots, and welcome back to the Patriot Dad channel, where we can discuss current events and modern issues, all while keeping it as real as possible. Today, I wanted to discuss with you and react to the most recent House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the subsequent takeover by the Taliban of the Afghan government. This hearing took place on November 14th, 2023, and was requested by my coworker, who I hope in the future to sit down with and interview about his time on the ground in Afghanistan at this time of history. So look forward to that in the future on the channel as soon as I can work out logistically how to make that interview work. This video will be a supercut due to its length. The hearing is just shy of 2 hours long, and I don't think anybody wants to watch a 2-hour response video to the hearing. In the future, though, I could be wrong, and if there's enough interest, I may dig it out of the archives and post the full-length reaction, but I will be editing it down for some brevity and adding in my own commentary. Let's get straight to the video then, shall we, since it will be quite a long one. So let's get into it.
April 14th, 2021, go to zero U.S. military withdrawal order in Afghanistan and the effect that this had on the Afghan military and Air Force in the middle of the Afghan fighting season.
So the go to zero order is a reference to withdrawing all troops out of the territory. So draw down to zero.
And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. As mentioned,
the good formalities of government. He's going to recognize himself.
we're going to examine the go to zero order. Past 27 months, the disastrous images of embassy personnel being airlifted off the roof in Kabul, the images of desperate parents throwing their babies over walls of HFAC.
HFAC is a reference to Hamid Karzai International Airport. That's the airport with which the airlift was taking place at. Just feature note.
The images of Afghans clinging to the wings of transport planes. They've been played on loops across media across the world. The purpose of today's hearing is twofold. It's not to just rehash those horrifying images.
Two things.
It's to pinpoint the day where it all went wrong, where you could say there's a day before and a day after, the day that President Joe Biden announced the go to zero order. And it's not just to provide an after-action report. It's to force President Biden to do something that it seems he hasn't been willing to do since the day he was sworn into office, and that's to live in reality. The reality.
Oh, shots fired pretty early. So what he's referring to is that we publicly announced the date that we were leaving. Crazy. Publicly disclosing anything with military operations is crazy. I don't know why we would do it, but living in reality, I don't know if Biden knows how to do that.
Of the circumstances that are going on around you. President Biden loves to say that the collapse of Kabul in August of 21 was inevitable, but anybody who was paying an ounce of attention can tell you that it wasn't inevitable. The collapse of Kabul wasn't something that we were headed towards in 2002. It wasn't something that we were headed towards in 2010 when I was airlifted off the battlefield of Kandahar. It wasn't something that we were headed towards in 2016 when...
The fact that we were there for almost 20 years is mind-boggling. At least this gentleman was there, so he can speak from a place of at least experience and knowledge. But to say that it was inevitable, yeah, like he said, since when? Since we first went over in 2002 after 9/11? Like, no. But as we talked about in one of our most recent videos on the Afghanistan withdrawal last week, is that the only thing that would have kept this from happening in the long term is probably a permanent presence there. And I don't think that Representative Mast, I don't think me or any of the other veterans that I know would think that is a desirable outcome. Permanent occupation of Afghanistan.
Donald J. Trump was elected. It wasn't something that we were headed towards on February 29, 2020, when the Doha Agreement was signed. It wasn't something that we were headed towards on January 20, 2021, when Joe Biden took office. It became inevitable on April 14, 2021, when Joe Biden publicly announced his plans for an unconditional withdrawal by September 11, 2021.
Okay, the fact that we even told people when we were going to leave unconditionally is just silly, just nonsense. But to pick the anniversary of September 11th to invite some sort of retaliation or reaction, like that's just bananas. I don't get it. That's craziness. Oh, let's go, Brandon.
President Biden loves to place the blame on the Doha Agreement and President Trump's negotiations. But in doing so, I believe that he is ignoring reality. Let's be clear, the Doha Agreement told President Biden what he had to do. But President Biden did not have to publicly announce any plans for a specific withdrawal date. Didn't have to be a hard and fast date that he announced to the world, a self-imposed deadline. President Biden did not have to redirect resources from fighting terrorists in all capacities to drawing down all operations at the height of the fighting season, as opposed to the winter months. President Biden did not have to knock the knees out from the Afghan military by cutting and gutting their air support, withdrawing key contractors, and pulling logistic capabilities. President Biden did not have to abandon Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night without so much as a Dear John letter to our Afghan partners.
Yeah, when I heard about that we had just left Bagram Air Base middle of the night, didn't say anything to the Afghan military or government, and stopped supporting them logistically. Like, what did we expect, man? Like, what outcome did we think we were going to get for that? That's madness. Unless it was intentional. Maybe.
President Biden did not have to ignore the fact that the Taliban was in violation of every single condition that was set forward by the Doha Agreement. All of those decisions were made by a commander-in-chief who was determined to, in my opinion, avoid reality, and whose only North Star was a political future, a political star. Our witnesses today will be able to speak to the reality that President Biden so obviously avoided. Mr. Roggio saw the writing on the wall as he tracked the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in real time. General Sami Sadat was forced to live with the consequences of Biden's delusion as his troops were left demoralized and without resources needed to defend their nation.
I apologize in advance. I'm going to be probably shaking my head a lot, and I'm probably going to be rubbing my eyes a lot, and I'm probably going to be just, in general, very similar reactions, just a lot. Probably because of a general sense of frustration over, I don't know, the 20 years of conflict that we just ran away from, that we all know people that were directly or indirectly impacted in a very negative way by this conflict over the last 20 years. The fact that we just left and the conditions with which we did it and the decisions that were made, you're going to see a lot of reactions and facial expressions, I'm sure. Yeah, let's keep going.
A nation that myself and my colleague both spent a good amount of time in. I also want to thank Dr. Dipali Mukhopadhyay. I've worked on saying that a couple times and I still mess it up, and I apologize. I'm going to have to say it a few more times. For being here today to lend your expertise and your opinion, and to recognize the members of the Afghan Army's National Female Tactical Platoon who are in attendance today. In addition, I want to recognize the fact that Miss Christy Shamlin, mother-in-law of Sergeant Nicole G, is here today. It's always nice to see you and appreciate you continually paying attention to this issue, taking of your time to continually do so. One of the 13 killed at the Abbey Gate. Here's why all of this matters. Let me wrap this up. The refusal to operate in reality that gave more than 13 families the title of Gold Star on August 26, 2021. It's the same delusion that has underestimated terrorists and led to 48 attacks against our U.S. military posts in the past month, not living in reality of what's taking place. Same delusion that allowed him to say that there's a safe and secure border, or that inflation is just a brief transient inflation. It's not a recognition of reality in foreign and domestic.
And we took an oath to defend ourselves against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Don't forget that. Oh, just a discussion about the 13 brings just chills to my spine. But it wasn't just the 13. Yes, those were the U.S. service members that died, but there were many more casualties that day, including civilians and injuries. It was not a good day.
Every minute that President Biden ignores the reality is another minute that our troops across the globe are put at unnecessary risk, and another minute that the network of terrorists from Taliban to Hamas are able to get closer to their goals of destroying the United States of America.
And we are now tying it back in, as I talked about last week, that we're gonna just keep trying to make sure we can drop bombs on those kids, man. We're bringing Iran and Hamas into this. I will be keeping an ear out for commentary during this hearing that is pro-war, because I am not pro-war. I'm not pro-human suffering. I am pro-America, and we will do what we need to do, but I don't want that.
I now recognize my friend, ranking member, gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, for any statement at any length that you may have.
Thank you, Chairman Mast, for calling this really important hearing. I would like.
Hey, hold up. Wait a fucking minute. This really important hearing. Hang on, let's count, shall we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 people actually there, and a couple of staff, it looks like, in the background. That better be the whole fucking committee, man. There might be more witnesses than people sitting on the committee today. See all the empty chairs there? Like, I don't know if they're all needed. I see other name tags in the second row there from the back, and I don't really see anyone in there. So is it really that important? Or is this a partisan thing? Is that because these committees are currently run in the House by the majority, which is the Republicans? So it'll be interesting to see, other than the ranking member for the Democrats, if there's anyone else in attendance. Or is this going to be one-sided like everything else, where they just divide all of us for everything? Partisanship, I hate it.
To begin by recognizing Ms. Shamblin for being here and for the sacrifice that your family has made for our country on behalf of all of us, a sacrifice of which we owe a great debt that our nation will never be able to repay, but we will certainly try to do that sacrifice credit here in moving forward. And I also want to recognize the members of the Afghan military, my Afghan brothers and sisters who fought this war with great courage, with great fortitude, and both of us leave pieces of our heart in Afghanistan and with you and your families. And thank you for being here today as well. The purpose here, though, is to have a debate about a very challenging period in our nation's history. The chairman talked about pinpointing the day it all went wrong. Our service members and the American people do deserve that. They deserve an honest assessment of that. They deserve honest.
I'm just going to comment real quick that they titled the chart Trump Steal. Okay, so we'll see where this goes. Let them cook a bit.
Honesty, and they deserve candor. And I, for my part, have been very clear about my criticisms of the withdrawal, and I continue to be clear about that. But telling the story of Afghanistan, our nation's longest war, 20 years, hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of lives, just American lives, but also tens of thousands or more Afghan lives, requires a broader look. It would be doing a great credit and disservice to talk about this simply as the story of August of 2021, because the day it all went wrong includes many days over many, many years. So I'd like to...
Many years, huh? I'm looking at the sign behind you, and there's 1 year. Let's see where you go with this.
Outline a chronology, a timeline that's extremely important here today. As you can see, starting on February 29th of 2020, there were 13,000 American service members in Afghanistan at the time that former President Trump signed the Doha Accord. By May 19th of 2020, there were 8,600 service members in Afghanistan. By September 3rd of 2020, Afghanistan was compelled to release 400 Taliban prisoners required under the agreement. Then by November 17th of 2020, we were down to 2,500 forces, or we announced a withdrawal of 2,500 forces by January of 21, before President Trump took off, or President Biden took office. Between December 1st and December 31st of 2020, there were 185 pro-government forces killed, over 3,000 security forces killed, and over 1,400 civilians killed by the Taliban during that period, far from compliance with the Doha Agreement. Then by January 15th, before President Biden took office, we had completed the withdrawal down to 2,500 forces. So the cement was hardening on the events of August 2021 way before it occurred. Highlighting a few key events. Again, it was February 29th of 2020.
Sure, there was blame to go around. But how does that answer why the decision was made to continue with this agreement? If we knew that they were in violation of all parts of the agreement already in January of 2021, why would you not just reverse course? Why would you not delay it or cancel the agreement? Where's the ownership in this, man? So we're going back to February of 2020. Let's see where we go with this.
Where Donald Trump signed the Doha Accord with the Taliban. Then you go to September 12th of 2020. The Afghan-Taliban talks finally start 7 months behind schedule. Then going to October 7th of 2020, Donald Trump started tweeting, and he said specifically that American troops would be home by Christmas. At the same time, they were trying to compel the Taliban to adhere to the deal and maintain security. The President of the United States is tweeting out that we're going to do an immediate withdrawal of troops, undermining everything that we had done way before 2021.
Yeah, sometimes that man tweeted too much, but some of those tweets were so good. But yeah, we shouldn't be tweeting or broadcasting publicly anything with the military such as that, whether it's Biden or Trump or anyone else. But man, that guy can troll on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it.
So by January 15th of 21, the Afghan first vice president says that Trump made too many concessions to the Taliban and that violence will only increase.
Okay, so if we know that, why did we not make changes to the agreement? Why did we not go back on the agreement? Why did we not increase our presence? There were so many alternatives. There were so many things we could do. They were already violating the agreement. Why are we sticking to it?
So yes, were there mistakes and missteps in August of 21? Undoubtedly there were. And we will do after action reviews, we'll have discussions to make sure that we can never repeat those mistakes again because we deserve to do better. Those who made the sacrifice that month deserve us to do better. But make no mistake, this is not the story of August 2021. And it would be doing a great disservice
to my Democrat friends or to the government as a whole. Who is it doing a disservice to, bro? Like, really? Who?
To the American people and all who made tremendous sacrifices if we did not recognize the many missteps that were made over 4 presidential administrations, Republican and Democrat, that were made over 10 Congresses, Republican and Democrat. Too many people sacrificed too much to look at this as a narrow story.
Okay, so we're going to not talk about the final decisions that led to the actual problem. Instead, we're going to stand around here like the fucking Spider-Man meme where everyone's just pointing at everybody else going, see, it's also his fault. It's also his fault. Are you a bunch of children? Jesus. God. Mary and Joseph, what is happening?
President Biden, when he took office in January 2021, with the lowest number of troops that we had in decades, faced a simple choice.
Fix it or fuck it up. That was his choice, in my humble opinion. He chose wrong.
Do we abide by the Doha Agreement that was negotiated under the prior administration? Or do we go back to war with the Taliban, in which case we would have to surge a tremendous number of forces to protect the Americans who were still there, and we would be fighting to this day. That was the choice. Now, you can disagree.
I mean, if you surge and do enough destruction and really purge the area, like, we're not going to make any friends either way. But if you could spend an extra 2 years after 20 and do significantly more damage and have an actual lasting impact and not just turn everything over to the Taliban within days of leaving. But I don't know. Like, I don't know. That's something I struggle with too. But just retreating the way that we did not end well. Would it be better if we had stayed the extra 2 years and maybe left a little more controlled manner and not left tens of billions of dollars of military equipment and everything for the Taliban to use against us in the future? Maybe we should have left a little slower. Maybe we should have taken our equipment with us. I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Hindsight being what it is. But God.
Agree one way or the other on what that choice should have been. But that was the choice he was facing. There was no status quo. That was the terrible choice, and he made the decision to withdraw and pull out and to comply with the agreement. So with that history in mind, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and having a discussion that befits the sacrifice of so many folks over the last 20 years. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Other members of the committee are...
He didn't really wait for an answer, but apparently no one was going to object, but still, like, that was awkward.
Reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. To start, again, we have General Sami Sadat, who was final commanding general of the Afghan National Army's Special Operations Corps and commanded the Afghan Army's 215th Maiwan Corps into August 2021. No one is better positioned to speak to the immediate and devastating impact of President Biden's go-to-zero order on the Afghan military's fight against the Taliban. Next, we have Mr. Bill Roggio, who is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense Democracies and a longtime editor of FDD's Long War Journal, where he has provided critical insight and analysis into the global war on terror and the war in Afghanistan. Finally, again, we have Dr. Mukhopadhyay, who is Associate Professor of Global Policy at University of Minnesota. She joined the university with tenure in 2020. She was previously a member of the junior faculty at Columbia University. Thank you all for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask that you keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize you, General Sadat, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, Congressman Crow, and members of the committee, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us for this hearing today. Before answering questions, I want to take a few minutes to make some remarks, and my remarks are divided in three parts in what is happening in Afghanistan under the Taliban now. Number two, why we got here, and number three, what are the possible solutions that I can recommend to the committee. For the past 20 years, the American people helped support and protect the people of Afghanistan, our people. We built a new society with your support where for first time girls were educated across the country and women were treated with equality. A new generation grew up with the hope that this time it would be different and Afghanistan would take its rightful place among the family of free democratic nations. Unfortunately, it was not to last. That hope was cruelly extinguished. But we remember how, in the hard times when President Biden and President Ghani turned their tail and ran away, it was you, members of Congress, who supported the efforts of your brave service members, men and women, who saved thousands of Afghan lives in the face of certain death.
Damn. Shots fired early by General Sadat here. Turned tail and ran. Both his own and our president. That is not a high opinion by one of the final commanding generals for the Afghan military, is it?
As our country collapsed. On behalf of the people of Afghanistan, I thank you. We will remember this for the rest of our days. 20 years after 9/11, Afghanistan fell back into the hands of the terrorists who were the very reason why 9/11 has happened. The consequences for the region and the world are grave. As we can see in the recent unfortunate events in the Middle East, the rise of Taliban has given new life to the groups like Hamas. Today, some 16,000 al-Qaeda terrorists are training in our country. Their leaders move freely between Afghanistan and Iran along a safe terror corridor. The former American base close to Kandahar Airport is now full of foreign fighters training as suicide bombers. They're so embedded into the Taliban system that the Taliban Ministry of Defense is using Al-Qaeda manual for its training. And it's not just Al-Qaeda. In our country today, we have the TTP from Pakistani Taliban, we have Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, we have Ansarullah of Tajikistan, and etc., etc. With the Taliban in power, terrorism has now time, space, and inspiration that were denied by the US military and the Afghan military. The Taliban have opened some 2,000 jihadi madrasas, housing 800,000 boys aged between 12 to 15. Their purpose is to train for global jihad. Why is this important? The Taliban are Sunni Muslims who follow a distorted interpretation of the Holy Quran, tailored to serve their authority. They divide the world into two zones. The first zone, Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, or the land of the peace. The second is Dar al-Harb, as known as Dar al-Kufr as well, the land of war or the land of the infidels. In their interpretation, the only place governed by Islam is Afghanistan. The rest of the world is a place to wage war, to expand their distorted version of Islam. They started this campaign from our neighbor in Pakistan, who nurtured them for so many years, with no mercy on children, women, and non-combatants.
It's actually really interesting to hear General Sadat's perspective and experience here and a little bit of a history lesson. This is quite educational. Very good.
The next place to wage war is the Middle East. They believe no Arab country is governed under pure Islam. Hence, they want to help Al-Qaeda topple Arab governments. For them to wage war, killing men and women, seizing property, and toppling businesses is an act of jihad to please God and die for the cause that will be rewarded in the afterlife. And they have allied with Iran, opening a corridor of terror from Afghanistan to Iraq, Syria, and the rest of the Middle East with the help of the Iranian IRGC. China, also our neighbor, is paying the Taliban large sums of money for access to Afghan mines and routes for Iranian oil via Afghanistan, blocking any access of the United States and allies in that region. How did we get here? In 2020 and 2021, as predicted, the Taliban ignored their side of the Doha deal. They didn't cut their links with Al-Qaeda and continue to conduct large-scale attacks on Afghan cities. To give you an example of their brutal attacks, in the 11 months of 2020 after the deal, the Taliban conducted 48,600 attacks, including car bombs, assassinations, and large-scale assaults on Afghan cities.
48,000 attacks in the 11 months? Wow. Yeah, talk about not following the agreement. Good night.
I'm running out of my time, Mr. Chairman. I will answer the rest of them in the Q&A. If you want to give me some time, I'll continue for another minute.
I can give you another minute. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir.
By all means.
In return, we were told to halt all military operations to give peace a chance. Our ammunition supply was halted, and 17,000 contractors who maintained our aircraft and software system had the orders to leave Afghanistan. Further, the Afghan government was told to release 7,000 Taliban prisoners, including men who killed American and NATO troops, drug dealers, and baby killers. We still stood our ground with whatever we could and kept fighting. But Secretary of State Mr. Antony Blinken wrote a letter to President Ghani in which it was made public, asking the president to resign and that to allow the Taliban-led government to come to power. This made it very clear to everybody in Afghanistan and in our region that the Afghan government no longer has the support and trust of the United States, hence giving a chance for Iran and Pakistan to come up with everything they have in support of the Taliban and lead into the collapse of our country. But despite the failure on the part of the Taliban to stick to the terms of the deal, President Biden still went ahead with the withdrawal, leading to the chaos of collapse of our country. It was a betrayal not only of the Afghan hopes, but of the sacrifice of over 200,000 Afghan troops and 6,000 Americans who died for our freedom. And some of them carry injuries, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, until this day. I know what loss means. Some of those brave warriors fell or were wounded when on an operation with me. To this day, I remember every moment and feel the pain in my bones. And I say to you now that I would be betraying the sacrifice if I didn't attempt to recover our land, where Afghans and Americans bled for freedom. It would be an insult to their sacrifice to allow the widows and children to be ruled by the brute, dehumanized Taliban. Mr. Chairman, I know we cannot go back in the past to change what has happened, but we can change the future and what is to come to us. We're not going to sit idle and let it happen. We're organizing now to recover our country, united under one flag with equal rights for women, inclusive of all minorities, and governed under a constitution chosen by our people. We have set up a political movement, Afghanistan United Front, to show our resolve in wanting a legitimate government in Afghanistan.
I get this feeling that the Taliban is not going to really support that political movement.
We're not asking American boots on the ground alongside us. We're asking for your moral and political support. In our history, like other nations, we have seen tough times and invasions, but we always came back together and saved our country. We will fight for freedom and to free our country again, making the Taliban rule a brief interruption in our history. We are ready for the great sacrifice. We will once again be one free nation under God. Thank you.
Thank you, General Sadat. I now recognize Mr. Roggio for your opening statement.
Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify, and thank you, General Sadat, and our other members of the panel here for taking the time today. There are many reasons that our mission in Afghanistan was troubled. There can be no denying that one decision, President Biden's April 14, 2021 order to withdraw from Afghanistan, is directly responsible for the collapse of the Afghan government and its security forces. And that was what we have been brought here today to discuss. Certainly, prior administrations contributed to the poor state of Afghanistan. The Afghan government and military created by President Bush was ill-suited to combat an insurgency. President Obama's strategy was muddled, its surge was under-resourced and executed on an unrealistic timeline, and the administration opened negotiations with the Taliban. And President Trump's deal with the Taliban, known as the Doha Agreement, was an absolute disaster. But this is extremely important. Despite the mistakes of previous administrations, on April 13, 2021, the government of Afghanistan was still standing, and the Afghan military and police were still fighting the Taliban.
I mean, that's a valid point. At the beginning, the chairman said he wants to know the day that before something was different and after something was different. Like you just pointed out, on the 13th of April, things were still functioning.
Despite statements from the Biden administration that it was cornered to execute the terms of the Doha Agreement, the administration was not obligated to do so. The Taliban was not living up to the terms of the deal as it continued to shelter and support al-Qaeda and other groups. The Biden administration knew this, and yet it followed through on the Doha Agreement anyway. The fact is that President Biden was determined to leave Afghanistan. The Doha Agreement was a convenient excuse to do so. President Biden's order to withdraw had an immediate and devastating effect on the Afghan government and military. Once the order was given, U.S. forces were no longer supporting their Afghan partners. Instead, the immediate focus was on packing up and leaving. We all remember the U.S. military turning off power at Bagram Air Base and leaving in the middle of the night without informing our Afghan partners. For another powerful example of this, I strongly suggest watching Retrograde, which documents the impact of the withdrawal on General Sadat's command. You will see that U.S. Special Forces, which supported the General Sadat's Corps, immediately ceased operations. Despite difficulties in the South, this team of Special Forces was crucial in supporting the Afghan military operations and holding the Taliban at bay. Without U.S. support, the Afghan military couldn't sustain its operations. We built an Afghan military that was dependent on Western contractors for maintenance and logistics. Without this support, Afghan air assets, which were operating at a high tempo due to the Taliban onslaught, were quickly degraded. There are other factors which I've highlighted in my written testimony that I do hope we discuss today. General Sadat can no doubt speak authoritatively from his experience on the impact of President Biden's withdrawal order and it had on his soldiers and their morale. One thing is clear. The outcome, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, was predictable. U.S. government, military, and intelligence officials said that the Afghan government wouldn't be under threat for 2 years after the U.S. withdrawal. After the withdrawal was announced, I predicted that the Afghan government wouldn't make it by the end of the summer. Kabul fell on August 15th. Panjshir, the last holdout province, collapsed on September 7th. Taliban didn't take control of Afghanistan in 11 days. This was a process that began the day that the withdrawal was announced, and it was set up by years of failure. How did multi-billion-dollar government organizations get it so wrong? These are questions that you must ask. The mistakes of past administrations were either correctable or could have been mitigated over time. The order to withdraw was final, and once executed, irreversible. However, if the Biden administration was hell-bent on leaving, it could have executed a phased withdrawal that it could have given the Afghan military a fighting chance. Why wasn't a responsible withdrawal from Afghanistan planned and executed?
Because that would have taken a responsible leader, sir. That's why it didn't happen. God, as much as I disagree with the war in general, I don't think we should have been there in the first place. But to leave in this manner, an embarrassment, a shame.
The implications of the withdrawal fiasco, both the decision to leave and the abandonment of our ally of 20 years, and the physical implementation of the withdrawal have lasting effects. We left an ally which sacrificed hundreds of thousands of its security personnel and an untold number of civilians battling the Taliban alone to the predations of a terror group that sponsored al-Qaeda both before and after 9/11. Al-Qaeda remains ensconced in Afghanistan and today is operating at least 6 training camps, as well as safe houses and a media operations center. Several Al-Qaeda leaders serve in the Taliban government. Sirajudin Haqqani, one of the 2 deputy emirs of the Taliban and its minister of interior. He is a specially designated global terrorist for his ties to Al-Qaeda. So are an untold number of his deputies listed as specially designated global terrorists. The Haqqani network, which Sirajudin Haqqani runs, is listed as a foreign terrorist organization. Sirajudin Haqqani's interior ministry issues national ID cards and passports to al-Qaeda leaders, operatives, and their families. Let that one sink in. Beyond Afghanistan, the ramifications of the precipitous withdrawal are still being felt today. Jihadists across the globe have been emboldened by our defeat. Our allies question our commitments. Our adversaries and enemies do so as well.
As they should. If we're just going to pack up in the middle of the night and leave and not tell you and leave you to the wolves, basically, why would anybody trust us? Then when you have a foreign organization like that handing out passports, that means they can travel on planes. Isn't that how we got here in the first place? What are we doing?
President Biden's order to leave Afghanistan has gravely impacted U.S. national security. We must accept these facts if we wish to avoid these mistakes in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Roggio. Now recognize Dr. Mukhopadhyay for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and for perfectly pronouncing my name. I appreciate that. Thank you to you. Thank you to members of the committee. Having spent my adult
I guess we can resolve today's hearing, know that we pronounced somebody's name correctly. So
life as a scholar of Afghanistan, it is a privilege to be with you. I first traveled there in 2004 and made 11 extended trips thereafter, the last of which took place in the summer of 2021. I start by stating a fact on which I presume we can all agree. America's longest war was not lost in 20 days or 20 months, but rather over 20 years. 4 presidents made decisions that brought us here, and each one's policies constrained those who followed. Ultimately, and in many ways, the logic, design, and implementation of the war doomed the Afghan Republic. This contention does not suggest American malice, nor does it absolve Afghan guilt. But we must be clear. The United States and its allies went to war in the fall of 2001 because al-Qaeda attacked our homeland. The subsequent promotion of women's rights, democracy, and development mattered to the degree they advanced the war on terror. A friendly government in Kabul, not a sovereign Afghan state, was the goal. This truth helps us understand the back to the future moment in which we and the Afghan people find ourselves with the Taliban once again at the helm. A number of early choices taken by the United States and its allies crippled the new Afghan government before it even got started. The Taliban regime fell swiftly, and its successor owed its existence to the West. In exchange, it would not control many of the fundamental decisions about power and politics on the ground. The Americans prevented President Karzai from exploring any genuine possibility of peace with those Talibs who sought surrender, a choice that would haunt U.S. governments years later when it aimed to negotiate with those same enemies on vastly worse terms. The United States emboldened Pakistan as a key partner in the war, even as the Pakistani security establishment gave sanctuary to those who killed American and Afghan forces for years.
yeah. So far, this gal, she's spitting some facts. They're uncomfortable. Like us giving a lot of support to Pakistan as they were hiding the people who perpetrated 9/11 in Pakistan. Like, oof.
Establishment gave sanctuary to those who killed American and Afghan forces for years to come. The coalition empowered anti-Taliban commanders as its core ground force early on and later as counterinsurgent militia forces. Even as some of those strongmen became valuable governing partners, others leveraged ongoing American support to their own ends, often at the expense of new civil and military institutions. The United States invested substantial aid in those institutions, but in erratic, incoherent, and unsustainable terms. The risks of such built-in dependencies were especially evident in the Afghan security sector. The triumph of foreign designs over Afghan self-determination was also exemplified in the international approach to elections. Foreign powers set an overly ambitious tempo and then selectively addressed fraud in terms that steadily undermined public trust and risked turning each electoral standoff into a civil war.
And when she says selectively, I think what she really means to say is they only looked into fraud if it didn't hurt them. Right? Like they looked into fraud if finding fraud meant it would help their candidate. That undermines confidence. That ain't good.
By the time the 2019 election arrived in Afghanistan, the Trump administration made clear that the time for our involvement there was over. A quick deal with the Taliban was a priority, even if that meant sacrificing the country's future as a democracy. The ultimate precarity of Afghan sovereignty would be...
I apologize for the popping of her microphone. I can't do a lot about it. If I adjust the sound down so that's not so loud, then you can't really hear her talk. I'm sorry about that. It's just really poppy. They need a new audio person.
Most vividly revealed in 2020 when the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. A boon to the Taliban, this deal undercut any remaining leverage the Afghan government might have had in subsequent negotiations to sue for peace without entirely sacrificing Republican values. The Trump administration then unilaterally dropped troop levels to 4,500 and just days before President Biden's inauguration to 2,500. Meanwhile, the Afghan government was forced to release thousands of Taliban prisoners, a provision in a deal to which it had not been a party. I was in Kabul in March 2020, and the sense of collective despair was palpable.
I mean, I bet when a foreign government says you have to release like a bunch of prisoners that you know are going to cause trouble and you didn't even have a say in it, like that is not good. Talk about undermining confidence. So like, I get it. People are upset. There was bad decisions all around.
Deeply disillusioned with their own leaders, Afghans were also resentful that their experiment with free politics mattered little to the Americans as we beat a path to the exits. My last visit to Kabul in the summer of 2021 is one I will never forget. Afghan leaders were both disbelieving about and therefore unprepared for the impending American departure, and yet also so crippled by its possibility that dysfunction had arrested the entire state. More striking, however, was the courage of my many longtime interlocutors in civil society, who understood that all they built was now in jeopardy. They vowed not to give up, though nearly all were eventually forced to leave in the face of near certain persecution or death. The progress they secured gives me great optimism for Afghanistan's long-term future. But their sacrifices, as well as those of our own, demand our honest and deep reflection. We may not again engage in state building in the service of countering terrorism, but all of our interventions disrupt the politics and lives of others profoundly. We must.
Yeah, and we really need to stop messing with other countries. Like, we've been doing it. Like, I did my song Party in the CIA. I've done a bunch of other, songs and other messages, fighting our own equipment, like the attack on Israel, all these other videos I've done where we're constantly talking about, we need to reduce human suffering. We need to stop meddling in these other countries and just let them be themselves. If they want to be more pro-West, let them be pro-West. If they don't want to be, don't force them. Like, I don't like it one bit. By forcing this, we just become the person that they accuse us of being. We become the bad guy. Like, how do we not see that? We encourage their recruitment against us when we make these decisions to drop bombs on kids over in their country. Like, if somebody flew some jets into the United States and dropped a bunch of bombs on a city we care about, I was going to say name of a city, but no one's going to agree that it's important. But if they just started dropping bombs on our kids, wouldn't we want retaliation? Wouldn't we put up recruiting posters and say, go fight against these bad people who dropped bombs on our kids? Like, wouldn't we do that? So why are we surprised when they do? Crazy, right?
Learn from the Afghan war both the productive possibilities and acute limits of American power, and try then to wield it with greater humility and care. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you all for your comments. I'm sorry, I cannot agree with what you said. I will just start by saying I do define a win as the outcomes being better than what I expected, and a loss being the outcomes being worse than what I expected. So I can't agree with you, but we'll have time to discuss this and debate this as everybody will. I will now recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Crow, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to talk about the chronology leading up to the drawdown that I touched on in my opening remarks. I served in Afghanistan multiple times. I served in Iraq. I've been in combat environments, and we know that the morale of forces is essential. The will to fight is the most powerful thing, right? More powerful than any weapon system, any strategy, any tactic, the will to fight. And morale is essential to that. So at a moment where we're trying to enhance morale, when we're trying to embolden our partners, there were a series of just deeply troubling statements and comments coming out of the former president's White House and from the former president himself. And I would like to start with you, General Sadat, on a few of these. Here you have President Trump tweeting out on October 7th of 2020, "We should have the small remaining number of our brave men and women serving in Afghanistan home by Christmas." Do you remember when that tweet went out?
I don't, but I was aware that he was trying to draw down troops to a minimum level.
What was the impact of this statement and your awareness and your force's awareness when these statements were being made?
Of course, statements made in Washington had a real impact, especially on us in the battleground, and these remarks have had its impact. But we continue to communicate with U.S. military, and we were told there was a backup plan, that if things go south, the U.S. military will get involved. And they were actually gearing up and preparing for that, because both us and the U.S. military, like you served there, we knew that this deal would not stand and we will get back on it.
Did you ever see this backup plan or get specifics of it?
I was...
I apologize to everybody. I'm trying to levelize the audio with my mixer board, but the ranking member here keeps getting closer and further from his microphone, which makes it very difficult for me to try and keep it from being too loud. So I apologize for that because I keep having to turn it up for the witnesses and turn it down for the members of the House. So just be patient with me. I'll try and levelize it in editing.
A part of a trip in, I believe it was in February of 2021 in Garamsey district, where General Miller and myself visited Navy SEALs camp in Garamsey, and there I saw that there was a plan that the SEALs told us that if the orders were given when the deal goes off completely, they can destroy the Taliban in southern Afghanistan in 9 days. So for me, that sounded like a quite reassuring backup plan.
That sounds like a good backup plan to me. Like, oh, if shit goes sideways, 9 days, we'll take care of it. Seems pretty reassuring to me. What do you think?
General, on November 11th, 2020, the former president wrote a memo, and in the memo he said, I hereby direct you to withdraw all U.S. military forces from the Federal Republic of Somalia no later than 31 December 2020 and from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan.
I didn't even realize we were in Somalia at that time. That's crazy. Yay, war machine.
No later than 15 January 2021. Were you familiar with that memo when it was signed? Because it went public.
No, sir, I don't recall. And I apologize for not recalling all of this. I was a combat soldier and I was always busy fighting. But these things had its impact for sure.
Can you comment on the morale of your forces in 2020?
The morale of the forces went very bad when the Doha deal has happened. It was so dramatic, not only our forces politically, also giving the region the sense that the United States is leaving, a deterrence posture was lost. Politically, we could never recover, Congressman Crow, from what happened in Doha. We were seen as a government that is not respected by its own allies.
Ooh. I mean, that's unfortunate, right? So like he just spoke to, by signing that agreement with the Taliban, we kind of turned our back on the government that we put in place in Kabul. Like, they weren't sitting at the table, right? Like, Karzai and his government were not there. The president of Afghanistan and his government weren't there. I could see how that would be very upsetting.
Mr. Roggio, I gather we disagree about the impact of the withdrawal from your opening statements. But I do want to just try to flesh out what I believe is a fact, and that is, if we had not abided by the timeline, and I know we actually extended the timeline of the withdrawal of the Doha Agreement, but if we had not abided by the extended timeline of the withdrawal, it was pretty clear from the evidence we've gathered in transcribed interviews and prior hearings that the Taliban would have resumed offensive operations against the United States military in earnest. And at that point, we had 2,500 troops, the lowest amount we had had in almost 20, actually over 20 years. How many troops would the United States had to have surged into Afghanistan if we had not abided by the withdrawal timeline?
I can't speak to the number. I think one of my problems with our policy in Afghanistan has always been a discussion of the number of troops and not the quality of troops that we put in there. We could have put 100,000 cooks in Afghanistan.
I mean, that man's got a point. You need fighting troops, not logistical support, not, as he just stated, cooks, but makes a lot of sense.
Afghanistan, and it may not have made a difference. But if we'd have put in 5,000 combat forces, probably would have made a significant difference. Sir, you referenced Somalia. President Biden put U.S. troops back into Somalia after President Trump withdrew them. Why did he do so? Because he feared the collapse of the Somali government. Why was Somalia and the collapse of the Somalia government more important than the collapse of our 20-year project in Afghanistan?
Good question. What do you guys think? I like how his posture right now is like, He's got that, yeah, what posture going right now, and I'm somewhat amused by it. Let's see what the response is.
On the issue of troops, I agree that composition of a unit is important, but 5,000 combat troops without support, without logistics, obviously does not matter. So would you agree, though?
Doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, they need logistical support, but fuck. I mean, but what? What do you mean doesn't matter at all?
That 2,500 troops on the ground would not have been sufficient, that we would have had to have increased our footprint in Afghanistan.
I do agree that we would have had to have increased our footprint. What that number is, I can't tell you, but again, the Afghan forces were fighting, and Afghanistan did not collapse on August 13th. So the question was Afghanistan important enough to the Biden administration to maintain a U.S. commitment in Afghanistan? If the answer was yes, then he would have had to have put a number of troops back in. And if the answer was no, then as he believed, he ordered a withdrawal. But the withdrawal, as I stated in my verbal testimony, was never conditioned to allow the Afghan government and military to succeed. They were not given a chance. So to answer your question, yes, we would have needed more combat troops in Afghanistan, but how the withdrawal was executed was entirely predictable, and we all witnessed the results of that.
Thank you for that. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Mr. Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the panel for...
Oh, I'm glad to see a few other people have shown up. It's so important of a topic that they had to, show up late, fashionably late, though.
everyone coming here and for your time of service. It's greatly appreciated. I want to comment on a few things, because every time that we try to get to the bottom of the final decision making, which is always at the behest of the commander-in-chief, somehow we find ourselves spending more time talking about Trump all over again. And I understand my left's infatuation and the Trump deranged syndrome, which overwhelms them. And I do hope that through NIH or others, they can seek help. The whole point is that...
Hang on. Hold up. He just told them to go seek help from the NIH for TDS. Okay.
This was a conditions-based agreement. It was very clear from the beginning that if the conditions were not met, and as you said, General Sadat, that there was a plan B, an alternative mechanism. The other thing that our colleagues continue to fail to acknowledge is that President Trump, towards the end of his presidency, had actually reversed his decision at the advisory of the generals and was going to maintain troops there to continue its support. We fail to always mention that piece of things. And it's funny to me that Biden, and Mr. Roggio, you said it so perfectly just now, I couldn't have said it better. He was so willing to do what was necessary to make sure that the fall of Somalia did not occur with the government there. He was so quick to go ahead and withdraw the Remain in Mexico agreement. But for some reason, that Doha agreement, he couldn't make any changes to whatsoever. It was absolutely mandatory. No one could change anything, even though he's the elected president. That wasn't a complete possibility. Can't understand that, but that's something else. The other thing is that I do agree with my colleague. There were many missteps in playing political football through multiple administrations and their understanding of what we're supposed to be doing and what the mission was to achieve. We were not originally there, as we all remember in 2001, to think about nation building. We were there for an actual counterterrorism operation, which was to go in and stop Afghanistan from being a safe haven of terror and to withdraw. What did we leave?
Hold on, before he answers. A safe haven for terror? Is that the answer? Not to mention that right next door in Pakistan was the people that perpetrated 9/11 like the whole fucking time. Like, just saying.
We left the Haqqani network, ISIS Khorasan, the Taliban, billions of dollars in equipment, and stronger now than they were before, and actually closer, I would argue, to achieving the goal of what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was trying to achieve with a caliphate and a singular ISIS cohesion, which is what we've left them, a full country to now terrorize, exploit, and to utilize. He's right that there was over 10 Congresses who had gotten this wrong, which is why I ran for Congress. One of the main reasons was to try and come in here to prevent what we've continued to see.
And honestly, I think we need more combat veterans in Congress, because they're going to be a lot more apprehensive about sending our kids to war, because they've been there. They've done that. They don't want to keep doing it. Unless, of course, they have friends on the board of Raytheon or Boeing or one of the other defense contractors, then they might. Nikki Haley. But that's neither here nor there.
Because the majority of Congress, by the way, only 17% were actual military veterans. And we wonder why we get it wrong. You know,
Man's got a point. Like I said earlier, we need more combat veterans in Congress. We need more combat veterans in the White House. We need more combat veterans in government in general, because they will be a lot less likely to send our kids to war.
My military and government service, I spent over 7 years of my life in Iraq, over 3 years in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia. I know a thing or two about poor decision making. And I'll go ahead and say this. It was not the fault of the boots on the ground who was carrying out their objectives, missions. It was the suits in D.C. who was ruining the entire thing. But we need to understand something. What we're looking at.
The thing is that that's now him. Be careful, sir. That is now you. Be a better suit.
Into is not just the fall of Afghanistan, but also to get an accountability for what is already being forgotten. And it is shameful, shameful that we're already forgetting our 13 heroes who had fallen at Abbey Gate. You know, our State Department sat in here talking about how they were there on the ground helping to find solutions, and they were with the troops day and night when those gates were available to help Americans and others to be able to get out. But my question still remains to the State Department. If you were there day and night with our military service veterans at those gates, then why do we have 13 fallen service members and not a single State Department member who had fallen with them?
Ouch. I mean, decent question, right? If they were supposedly there, why aren't they among the 13?
That doesn't tell me that you were at the gates when it was necessary. Mr. Roggio, I got a question for you, sir. Prior to the U.S. full withdrawal from Afghanistan, you looked at publicly available information and warned that Afghanistan was likely to fall to the Taliban by the end of summer of 2021, which is exactly what we saw happen. Same thing that we warned about, because we knew that NPRI and others, and again, I think it's a different hearing, but we should be actually setting up a subcommittee that reviews the subcontractors who is more worried about supplying information that basically showed them in a positive light so they could win more contracts and follow-ups, as opposed to the ground reality where they were evaluating the willingness to fight, the necessary equipment, and the strategy on the ground. But having said that, from your perspective, was the problem with the conflicting or incomplete intelligence, the leaders, or was it both?
Sir, I think a mix of both in my experience. I created the map that we all saw on television over the summer of 2001, where I assessed the security in the district. I started that, I think, in 2014 because
I'm pretty sure he meant to say 2021. 2001 in the summer, we hadn't even had 9/11 yet. Just saying.
I was testing the Taliban's counter strategy to ours. The Taliban said, fine, you want to protect the cities and key districts, we'll go in the rural districts and we'll meet you in the cities. And I began gathering data, and over time it became very clear to me that the Taliban had a strategy and it was implementing it. The problem...
See, I think that's another failing that we had, is that we discounted the Taliban and the fighters that we were fighting against. We discounted them as some sort of rural, uneducated, ineffective, just rudimentary, and almost medieval. Like, we didn't give them the credit that they deserved. They definitely planned stuff. They pulled off 9/11, right? Like, I mean, why did we not give them that credit? Why were we trying to pretend like we had this great military strategy and they had none? Arrogance.
I think I can't just blame the suits, sir. I think that part of our military leadership and the top level leadership within the intelligence community is also responsible for this, and they need to be held to account. We were given very rosy assessments that I could easily disprove, and journalists and other experts who covered, for instance, there were times where the U.S. estimate that was released by SIGAR would say, like, the province of Kunduz, which I can't remember, I think it has 7 districts. The SIGAR would say something like, oh, only 1 or 2 are Taliban controlled and 1 or 2 contested. Everyone who followed Afghanistan closely would know that just about all the districts were contested, and the Taliban controlled at least 2 districts at a time. So this is what I saw, and some of this was because generals didn't want this stuck on their performance view. Some of this was political, because, you know, look, you had General Miller stand up and say, after he canceled SIGAR's reporting of the data on the districts, he stood up and said, well, it doesn't matter. Security in the districts doesn't matter. What matters is negotiations with the Taliban.
Yikes. We all know how important metrics are to management. Make sure your metrics look good. That's what's important. Don't worry about how things actually are on the ground. Oh, man. It doesn't matter. All that matters is negotiations. That's from like a total place of weakness. That is atrocious. I don't like it.
The top level of the U.S. military was infected by this political solution, this negotiated solution, and that has significant effects. People that I have spoken to during this, that were in the military or intelligence services, people that worked, that did the hard work, they understood what was happening in Afghanistan. But as the information made it up the chain of command, it was softened and softened. And why did we need to have, for instance, statements like, there's only 50 to 100 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, or the Taliban ties to al-Qaeda are weak or non-existent? Because Ultimately, 3 presidents wanted to leave Afghanistan. President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all wanted to leave. And in order to do so, there could not be significant ties between the Taliban and Al Qaeda could not have a significant presence. Look, that's another.
At least a stated presence. We have to say they weren't there, whether they were actually there or not. In order to save face and leave, the public had to think that everything was fine. Mission accomplished, right? I mean, that goes back to Bush. That was a joke with Bush. So it's actually 4 presidents. You can't say that we're ready to leave if you actually think that there's a mission to execute and to be there for a purpose. Like, you can't say that there's a reason to leave if the mission isn't complete. So what he's talking about right now is they were clearly lying to make it seem like things were better than they were on the ground to justify a withdrawal. Bananas.
Another thing that I tracked here, they would tell us 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda were in Afghanistan, and yet we would kill anywhere from 25 to 75 Al-Qaeda that were operating. This is from U.S. military's own press releases that I would track. So did Al-Qaeda have this sort of steady state where they kept it at 50 to 100, with this estimate stayed the same? It only went away when we conducted a raid on a terrorist training, or 2 Al-Qaeda training camps in Kandahar in October 2015, I believe it was, and they killed almost 200 Al-Qaeda fighters. So, I apologize.
Wait a minute. 200 is greater than 100. That can't be right.
For telling a long story here, but there was significant problems within the military. I'm talking the higher level leadership within the military, within the intelligence community, and with our political leadership. And I do hope that a committee is set up to get to the bottom of these key issues, because, if what happened in Afghanistan stayed in Afghanistan, oh, well, fine, we lost a brush war. Sorry, my Afghan friends who are friends, and I obviously am being sarcastic there, because we should maintain commitments to our allies, but it doesn't. What happens if we're getting it wrong in Ukraine? What happens if we're getting it wrong with Taiwan and China?
I know, we can keep bombing kids. That's what's important. We need to get the F out of all these places. Like, just stop. Pull back, fix our own problems before we try and fix the frickin' world. Stop shipping everything overseas. Stop importing everything. Stop. Just take a frickin' minute. Just stop. Take a minute. Pull back. Fix our own problems. Stop letting people in. Stop. Fix our problems at home. Then we can worry about exporting greatness overseas from a position of strength. We just need to stop this nonsense.
These are the questions that we need to ask.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing the witness to go ahead and fully answer this. I agree. We have a counting issue. We didn't know how many Americans were left in Afghanistan. When they said 300, 3,000, 30,000, didn't know. We continue to get this wrong, and that's why we shouldn't engage in warfare unless we're willing to see it through, get back to an America First agenda, and make sure that we're doing this right so we don't repeat Afghanistan again. With that, I yield back.
I agree.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. I now recognize Ms. Cherfilus-McCormick.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I want to say thank you so much for all of our members and who served in Afghanistan. Thank you for your service. And for everyone who's testifying, thank you so much for your service. I have a few questions for you. But first, I want to start off that the point of this hearing is for us not to be blame shifting, but really to identify and isolate what are the instances that happen. And
let me predict it. We're going to narrow it to the prior administration.
So we can look for accountability points. And so with that, I kind of want to stay away from the rhetoric about Trump and who's infatuated with it, but really look into the cumulative effects of the leadership and what led to Afghanistan.
I'm shocked. She actually doesn't want to just blame Trump. Continue.
So I just want to find some facts here. I want to start off with a question for Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Dr. Mukhopadhyay, we already discussed that at the time of the withdrawal, there were only 2,500, and we saw that Mr. Roggio already admitted that that wasn't a number that could have been sustainable towards winning. But I wanted to hear from you about that. Do you think that we could have sustained that presence in Afghanistan with only 2,500?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. I think it's important to understand the 2,500 number in context, right? I want to underscore something that General Sadat said, which I think is very powerful. He said, after the Doha agreement, quote, politically we could never recover, unquote. So I think for me, we have to understand how did we get to 2,500 when we had double, 5-digit number, right?
For clarification, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but who
Nope.
signed us into the Doha Agreement?
President Trump signed the Doha Agreement. So that was an agreement that was negotiated without the Afghan government at the table. It was an agreement that basically satisfied the minimum American demand and the maximum Taliban demand, and secured a promise of American withdrawal on an established timeline, right? And what that, I think, did was signal, we can talk about the military consequences of having troops on the ground or not, but I think the political consequences are central, and that's why I underscored General Sadat's comment.
I mean, she's not wrong. By negotiating without the Afghan government at the table, like we kind of shot all hope they had of long-term success right in the face. It was a bad agreement. So when you take office, get us out of the agreement, just like you got us out of Remain in Mexico, just like you got us back into Somalia, just like all kinds of other decisions executives have made. If you don't think the agreement was good, when you got into office, you should have canceled the agreement immediately and ramped troops back up. But that's not what you wanted. You wanted to be the president that got us out, wanted to get out. I don't know whether your Chinese friends wanted us out so they could get a hold of rare earth minerals in Afghanistan or what. Either way, you got us out still. So the agreement might have been bad. Trump's government might have done it bad. I'm willing to concede that. But bro, take some freaking responsibility.
Signal a drop to zero.
I wanted to refocus us back to the number of troops because
Sure.
we're going to have more questions. But the sustainability of 2,500 troops, what is it going to be sustainable to stay there and actually assist the Afghans?
No, I don't think so.
And so my next question is for anyone who would like to answer it. Now, it seems like both administrations had the goal to withdraw all the troops. Would we agree to that?
Yes.
And so with both administrations having that goal, is there a reason that you believe they would both articulate this clear goal at the time?
My understanding is that both administrations felt that the longest American war needed to come to an end.
Yes.
I think that the speed with which the Trump administration moved forward and signaled both to the Taliban and the Afghan government that Americans would withdraw no matter what began a cascade of events that at that point, the outcome for the Republic was sealed from that point onward.
And could you, this question's for anybody who wants to answer it, could you describe in detail how you believe the Taliban would respond if the U.S. did not pull out?
We don't know the answer to that question. We certainly never got an opportunity to find out.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, let me put on my time machine hat and let's go find out for you real quick. Kind of a dumb question is that? There's no way to know. They'd be upset. They'd ramp up attacks. Sure. But would they have been effective? Don't know. Would it have been enough to topple the government? Don't know. Like, what do you want, lady?
To the point of could 2,500 troops have secured or have aided the Afghan security forces? I can tell you on April 13th, 2021, they were aiding.
So how could you say with substantial certainty that if we had stayed in, we would have actually won and helped that?
I certainly can't say with certainty,
I was about to say, he didn't say that.
Congresswoman. But what I can say with certainty is that the withdrawal order directly led to the collapse of the Afghan government and military.
And that order was a derivative of the Doha Agreement.
No, the current administration made that order. It might have followed the Doha Agreement, but the current administration made that final order. Own it, please.
Correct?
Ultimately, look, President Trump could have pulled all of the troops out of Afghanistan by the day that he left office. He did not. Mm-hmm. President Biden had the opportunity to adjust course. Mm-hmm. Again, he had a decision to make. Was it worth supporting the Afghan government or was it not? He chose that it wasn't. So look, I mean, I could blame the Bush administration. I could blame
Well, I mean, looking back at all the other decisions Biden has made that have benefited China, this one sure as hell benefited China. Just saying.
There's 2 decades of blame to go around, but there was only one decision, only one order to withdraw, and that was issued on April 14th, 2021.
But that, I mean, when we say that, when you make that statement, it makes it seem as if that was independent of the agreement. And I'm looking for, because you said with substantial certainty that if we did not
Oh, I'm sorry. Was he not the chief executive at the time?
Pull out, that the government would have been standing, but we already identified the
Your pull-out game is weak.
terms of the agreement, the timeline where we had 3 administrations who were setting us down that road. In addition to that, we also have both of the administrations who were trying to pull out completely. So with us not identifying with a substantial certainty that 2,500 could have won and not being able to understand why did both administrations try to actually pull out or have that goal, I just don't feel comfortable that we have pinpointed what went wrong.
What answer do you want? They didn't want to get Afghanistan pregnant? Like, Jesus, lady.
And how can we in the future make sure that this doesn't happen again? I don't know if you want to.
Oh, I don't know if you look at our history. You can look at my video for fighting our own equipment. This will happen again. Mark my words. This will happen again. Because nobody in power seems to want to prevent it from happening again. Somebody's going to get rich off of it, and it will happen again.
Extend any more time, or if anybody can help us find those facts to identify what went wrong so we can preclude them in the future.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, and I'd like to give my fellows an opportunity to speak. You know, I can't build a time machine and change the withdrawal order and find out. I wish I could, but
exactly.
I certainly cannot. But, you know, I just maintain that the Trump agreement, there was no bigger critic of it than myself. It was a bad deal, and it's one that should have been recognized. President Biden himself called it a bad deal, and yet he executed that. Why are we not asking that question? And with that,
I smugly sit back and let you answer.
Ma'am, I think there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just have to pause this. Look at her face. She's like, yeah, you're right.
There is a point that we all need to understand. Oftentimes, we see the U.S. politicians do not understand the capability of their own military.
Shots fired. No, the people in charge have no idea what they're doing.
2,500 U.S. trigger pullers was more than enough to support this. And ask me this because the nature of the U.S. operation has completely changed. In 2019, when I was commander of JSOC, we partnered with General Chris Donahoe, one of the best warriors that America has. And by the end of the year, we retook 12 districts, destroyed 4 Taliban customs, which was the main income of the Taliban, and we have destroyed 34% of the Taliban combat power with a new room built, which we called it CSAR, Combined Situational Awareness Room. The United States military has a lot of technology, very sophisticated. If you allow them politically to use it, to pull the trigger. And also, please remember, there was the Afghan forces as well. Your troops ended combat operations in 2016. It was the Afghans that were fighting. We were protecting American bases. 2021, Congressman Waltz was in Kandahar, and it was Afghans. And please know that even though when the Taliban wanted to attack the American troops, there was no way they could pass the Afghan side of it. So it was pointless if they went on a killing spree.
I also love how he referred to the troops as trigger pullers. Because like they said earlier, you could send 100,000 cooks, it wouldn't help. But you send 2,500 trigger pullers, they're getting some work done. But he's right. I mean, the Afghans were providing support, not really support. They were the ones fighting. We were providing support and logistics. So we were supporting them, but they were doing the majority of the work. We were training them. We were giving them, ammunition and other support. But like these guys, the people in charge have no idea, except for the few up there who actually served on the ground. The majority of the people in charge have no idea what they're talking about. None.
Believe me, if they could kill an American infidel, they would. It was just they didn't have the access, but they sold this so expensively on the American side that we're no longer going to attack your troops.
And that's how it should be. You should be afraid to attack Americans. Do you think they are now?
The point on President Trump, we also felt that he recoursed his decision. And I was told that he wants to keep Bagram, he wants to keep Kandahar. I don't want to get into this blame game, but what is happening today is as a result of the United States leaving Afghanistan, we lost a country. And believe me, you lost reputation. You have less access in the world today. You have less capabilities on counterterrorism in the world. You have less strategic maneuverability in Southeast Asia, and you have less competitive advantage by not having an allied government inside Afghanistan. Even we would have been able to sustain with 2,500 if we got continuous.
So you can say, thank you so much for your giving.
Did she just really cut him off? Bam. Stay in your lane, please. Let the guy cook.
Us this time, but you can say with substantial certainty that 2,500 would have been enough.
He's the general from Afghanistan who was on the ground. Who else has the expertise to make that statement but him? He just did. 2,500 trigger pullers and logistical support was enough. It was enough. April 13th. Bro, this girl, this representative needs to check herself before she gets wrecked.
Even though the other two don't
Again.
believe so.
Yes, ma'am. It was enough before they came out, so it would have been enough.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
You're welcome.
Yeah, she's like, I'm not going to ask any more questions because that's an embarrassment.
And I'll just say, I said this once, I'll say it again. I think it's important to define terms. And as Americans, we define terms as win or loss for America. And I define that specifically with a win is the way we execute this, we end up with outcomes that are better than what we anticipated. A loss is we end up with outcomes that are worse than what we anticipated.
I fully agree. And we lost.
And what happened with the way the Biden administration did this ended up with outcomes that were immeasurably worse than what was anticipated.
Not just for us, for the average Afghan civilian, for Israel, for all of the people who from that day forward will be affected by global terrorism. Their outcomes are worse because of that day.
And that's how I define win and loss for America.
Thank you for making it to the end of this video. This is going to be part of a two-part video because of the length. I hope that if you enjoyed it, you can give it a like and leave a comment below, and that you can subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon so you can be notified when I release the second half. Please share the video with friends and family, and leave a comment if you have a recommendation for a future topic. I hope you all have a great week. I'll see you next week with part 2. Take care, everyone. God bless, and bye for now. Go ahead and check out one of the links on the screen now to either subscribe to the channel and see the rest of the videos of the channel, or one of the carefully selected videos that you may wish to see that YouTube has used its algorithm to select for you.